the sub-provisions 1, 2, 3 used to say or, meaning any one of the three would be sufficient. And based on your presentation and the substitute the mayor is going to offer, just want to be clear that it now says and, meaning they are all three necessary conditions that must be met. Is that correct?
Absolutely, Commissioner Fish. Thank you for pointing that out. And that's an important change between the ordinance that was filed and the ordinance as presented in the substitute. When there were ors in the ordinance, it did provide more flexibility for the police commissioner to respond to different situations. But there was a concern about wanting to clearly limit the authority of the police commissioner and make it clear that it could only be used if all three of those criteria were met. And that change has been made in the substitute. So now you need all three of those. The history of violence, the safety of participants is at risk, and a substantial likelihood of violence based on facts you know. That's a very important change. And then the other part of this ordinance is the requirement that the police commissioner issue written orders in advance. And that's important for a couple of different reasons. The first, practically, is it gives advance notice to the public about what the rules are for the demonstrations. It can be very difficult for police and demonstrators to try to manage the rules the day of. We've heard folks say that it's difficult for them to understand orders that are given by the police, by the loudspeakers the day of, and it's hard to know the right place to go if you're trying to be there to demonstrate or counter-demonstrate peacefully. This would allow the police commissioner to let people know the rules of the road in advance in writing. The second important part of the written orders is it would require the police commissioner to state factually in writing how those three criteria that we talked about are met. So this doesn't just leave it to the police commissioner to say, I'm going to issue these orders based on no facts. He's got to affirmatively state in writing how all three of those criteria are met. And that's important, particularly because courts have said when you're evaluating these types of time, place, manner restrictions, that type of written record is very important for the court to review. And without a written record, courts are very concerned that a public official might be using unfettered discretion. But by requiring those written orders in advance to satisfy those three criteria, the court can better evaluate whether those time, place, manner restrictions were reasonable. There's further limitations on what can be in the written order, and they're spelled out in the ordinance. Another example of that is how the demonstrators and counter demonstrators can be redirected, and I would point you to section D3, Directive D3, and this is an important point, where any such redirection shall be to a location that is reasonably close to, sufficiently approximates, or reaches substantially the same audience as the original location. So, and that's another important principle that you get from the case law, that sometimes the location of a chosen demonstration is important for the message. And so if the government is going to issue time, place, manner regulations and redirect demonstrators and counter-demonstrators, it needs to be reasonably close to where they want to be so they can reach the reasonable, substantially the same intended audience. The last thing I want to just talk about briefly are some of the further checks on the police commissioner's authority in this. The first, by requiring the written orders in advance, it allows the public to evaluate the reasonableness of the use of this discretion and the reasonableness of the restrictions. And by having a police commissioner, an elected official, issue those written orders, it allows for some public accountability there. So they can judge the use of the discretion in the written order, and they can hold a public official accountable. like I mentioned before, the written orders allows a court to review these in advance if they're challenged. So the court can see at the time when these decisions were made what the factual basis was. Third, there's a provision in the ordinance that has been added since it was originally released a couple of weeks ago that would require the police commissioner to report back to council within 30 days after using this authority. So the council would get to hear the lessons learned, would get to evaluate whether the authority was used properly. And then the final provision is there's a sunset provision that currently would have this ordinance sunset at the end of 2019. So if it works, and it's a useful tool, the council can vote to continue it. If not, it expires.
Robert, I'd like to add one more to the list, which you diplomatically left off the list. As the order would be issued by the police commissioner, in this case me, that also subjects the police commissioner to potential lawsuits, which means the police commissioner can be deposed. And therefore, there's an incentive for the police commissioner to be very judicious in the use of this tool and use it in a limited manner.
Yes, sir.
In my opinion.
Yes, sir. That's part of the
Been
public.
deposed recently.
That's part of the public accountability and the accountability through the court systems.
Now that's interesting.
Does that complete your presentation? Yes, sir. Very good. Chief Outlaw, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me and allowing me to provide some information from the police perspective today regarding this very important ordinance. First, I think it's important to acknowledge the many protests and demonstrations, marches and events that's occurred over many years here in Portland. And a lot of those have ended with little to no incident. They've been peaceful, and those are the ones that don't make the news. But I want to acknowledge what's going on right now. I've seen some narrative out there flat out stating that Chief Outlaw just wants more power. This is not about me. Me taking this job is not about me. Violent protests are not solely a Chief Outlaw concern or a Mayor Wheeler or Police Commissioner Wheeler concern. In fact, violent clashes between demonstrators in Portland have existed long before the two of us took positions here in Portland. However, recently we have seen an increasing number of violent protests where various groups come together for the purpose of fighting or committing violence. This is a community concern. We have received numerous phone calls and emails from the community, and I acknowledge their frustration of not being able to move about the city, not being able to get home, pick up their kids, or get to work in a timely manner during violent protests. But not only have I heard from these community members, I've heard from other people who aren't even from here, who are fearful to come downtown. I've also heard from those who identify as activists who want to peacefully protest about certain issues, but have been silenced from others. Others who use fear tactics when it's believed that their ideologies did not align with theirs. As such, these activists fear for their safety amongst those who come together for the purpose of fighting or committing violence. And instead of them coming to exercise their First Amendment right to free speech, they stay home. The community is fed up, and they no longer want to see our beautiful city seen as a place to be disrespected by violence and lack of care and consideration to those who wish to exist safely and without threat, whether physically or fiscally, to their livelihoods. We want to make this a safe environment for everyone. And as the police commissioner and Mayor Wheeler referenced earlier, the Ninth Circuit has said, adding large numbers of police on the street might be the solution in some cases, but in other cases could lead to more intense violence. And I agree. adding more police to respond to violent protests is not always the answer. I've also heard, why should we give you another tool when you don't use the tools that you have? I will begin by stating that the question in and of itself isn't completely factual, and I'll tell you why momentarily. But my immediate response to that is, why not? I believe we all share the same goals. We want to ensure that everyone has the right to safely exercise their First Amendment right to free speech. We want demonstrations to conclude without injuries to anyone involved or anyone in the immediate area. We want demonstrations to conclude without damage of property or infrastructure. But most importantly, we also want all of this to happen without the use of any force necessary by the Portland Police Bureau. When it comes to crowd management, there is no one set defined tool for any one demonstration, and there are no cookie cutter responses. The more tools we have to utilize in our tool belt to address violent demonstrations will allow us to be more strategic and proactive in preventing violence before it begins. Furthermore, a response relying solely upon arrests during violent demonstrations is reactive, and it increases the likelihood that force by the PPB will be used. If we continue to focus solely upon arrests, we are not addressing the root cause of the issue at hand, and we are too late because the violence has already begun. The existing tools only allow police, when possible or feasible, to address violence after it occurs. Over time, including prior to my arrival 1 year ago, we have utilized the tools and laws available to us during violent demonstrations. This has resulted in arrests, uses of force to cease the violence, lawsuits, increased violence between groups, and even on one occasion, 200 officers on a skirmish line. We've also tried a hands-off approach when our presence exacerbated the situation and have sought to identify and arrest individuals after the incident. Let me tell you how we currently manage protests. When we learn about an upcoming protest or a demonstration, the Police Bureau members attempt to communicate with event planners, and we even assign police liaisons. The groups often do not usually respond to our concerns about safety or security. We then develop a plan, coordinating our responses with the resources that we have. However, this is difficult when we don't know when and where groups of people will march. The Police Bureau has expended considerable resources in past events trying to ensure that these groups remain a safe distance apart. For example, during the August 4th protest, it required more than 200 officers, as well as mutual aid by other agencies to respond. A critical component of this response meant that we had to redirect police resources during these demonstrations and were unable to answer 911 calls for service. We also had to call on neighboring law enforcement agencies who are also short-staffed to assist. Once these groups of people who have engaged in past violence come together, we don't know when and where they will engage in fights or assaultive behavior. It can be during a march, in the middle of a large crowd, or occur at a place where police cannot readily or easily respond. In addition, there can be challenges in responding to these acts of violence, as it takes a tremendous amount of resources to safely make arrests and control violent crowds. Unlike some other major city police departments, we are not in close proximity to other departments of comparable size. Thus, when requesting mutual aid, neighboring agencies cannot offer large numbers of personnel to assist and may be traveling from long distances to get here. So I'm saying all of this to say we've utilized the tools that we've had for past demonstrations, and we've been innovating in our planning when we had the luxury of being able to plan in advance. Yet, after all of this, we still continue to see violence when these groups come together. Some of the costs associated with our crowd management efforts has been as follows. Since 2016, we have spent $2,945,327. So far this year, that was $441,685 in overtime to address demonstrations here in Portland. This does not include overtime taken as comp time. When pulling officers from other areas in the city to address these demonstrations, we've been forced to limit our responses to calls for service to priority calls only. At times when possible,